Next day, Marilla didn't tell Anne about her conversation with Matthew. She gave Anne a lot of work in the kitchen. Marilla, said Anne excitedly, I have to know about my future. Please tell me, are you going to send me away? No, said Marilla. You can stay at Green Gables with Matthew and me, but you have to be good. Anne started to cry. Why are you crying, Anne? Asked Marilla in surprise. Don't you want to stay with us? Don't you like Green Gables? Oh, yes, Marilla, cried Anne. I like it very much. I'm crying because I'm very happy and I will always be happy. Some days later, Mrs. Lane came to tea with Marilla. When she arrived, Anne was outside. Marilla and Mrs. Lynde sat in the kitchen and talked. I think you are making a mistake, said Mrs. Lynde. You don't know anything about children. No, but I can learn, said Marilla. Anne ran into the kitchen. She saw Mrs. Lynde and stopped. The Cuthbert didn't take you for your pretty face, Mrs. Lynde said. She is very thin, Marilla, and her hair is as red as carrots. Come here, child, I want to see you. Anne ran across the kitchen and stood in front of Mrs. Lynde. Her face was red and angry. I hate you, she cried. I hate you, I hate you. Anne, cried Marilla. You are a very rude woman, Anne told Mrs. Lynde, and you are fat. Anne, go to your room, said Marilla. Wait for me there. Anne started to cry. Then she ran upstairs. Mrs. Lynde got up from her chair. I am going to home now, Marilla, she said. That child is very wild. You will have a lot of problem with her. But you said unkind things about her, said Marilla. After Mrs. Lynde went home, Marilla went upstairs. Why did Anne say those things? She said unhappily. Now Mrs. Lynde will tell everybody in Avonlea about her. Stop crying and listen to me, Anne, she said. You were very rude to Mrs. Lynde. She was a visitor in my home. But she was very unkind, said Anne. I want you to say sorry to Mrs. Lynde, said Marilla. Never, said Anne. I'm not sorry. Marilla remembered something. When she was a child, her aunt often talked about her. Marilla is not a very pretty little girl, they said. Maybe Mrs. Lynde was unkind, said Marilla quietly. But you have to say sorry. Stay here in your room. Next morning, Anne didn't come down for breakfast. Marilla told Matthew the story. She was very rude, she said. But Marilla, said Matthew, Mrs. Lynde doesn't think before she speaks. Please don't be angry with Anne. Anne stayed in her room all day. Marilla took food upstairs, but Anne didn't eat very much. In the evening, Matthew went quietly up to the aunt's room. Anne was on a chair by the window. She looked very small and unhappy. Matthew felt very sorry for her. He closed the door. Please go and say sorry to Mrs. Lynde, Anne, he said. All right, Matthew, said Anne. I was not sorry yesterday, but I am sorry now. I will do it because you asked me. Good, said Matthew happily. It's very quiet downstairs without you, Anne. He went quietly out of the room. Later, Marilla and Anne walked to Mrs. Lynde's house. I'm very, very, very sorry, Mrs. Lynde, said Anne. I was very rude to you. You were right about my red hair, and I am thin and ugly. Mrs. Lynde smiled. I was rude to you too. She said, You do have red hair, but maybe it will change color when you are older. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Lind, said Anne. Now I can hope for prettier hair. Please, can I go outside and play? Yes, of course, said Mrs. Lind. Find some flowers. Anne went out and closed the door behind her. Anne is really sorry, thought Marilla, but she is funny too. She is a strange little girl, said Mrs. Lynde to Marilla, but she is not a bad child. I like her. On the way home, Anne suddenly put her small hand to Marilla's hand. I love Green Gables, Marilla, she said. It's my home now. Anne had only one ugly dress from the orphanage, so Marilla made her 3 new dresses. She bought a little hat for Anne too. But Anne didn't like the new clothes. Why don't you like them, Anne? Asked Marilla. They are not pretty, answered Anne. But they are very good dresses, said Marilla. Marilla went to church every Sunday. She wanted to take Anne with her, but the next Sunday Marilla was sick. Can you go to church without me? She asked Anne. Yes, of course, Marilla, answered Anne. She put on one of her new dresses and her hat and started walking down the road to church. I don't like this hat, she thought. It's not very pretty. Then she had an idea. There were lots of beautiful yellow flowers by the road. Anne put some flowers on her hat. When she arrived at church, the other children looked at her. That girl's crazy, they said. After church, Anne ran back to Green Gables. Did you enjoy it, Anne? Asked Marilla. Not very much, said Anne. The minister talked for a long time, but he was not very interesting. But there's going to be a party next week for the children of Avonlea. That's exciting. Please, Marilla, can I go too? Yes, of course, answered Marilla. Oh, thank you, Marilla, said Anne. She put her arms around Marilla. Marilla felt happy. I'm starting to love this child, she thought. Marilla had a beautiful old brooch. The day before the party, she couldn't find it. It was on the top of the desk in my room, she thought. But now it is not there. Where is it? Did you take my brooch out of my room? She asked Anne. No, Marilla, said Anne. I went into your room last week. I saw the brooch on the top of the desk and put it on my dress. But then I put it back on the desk. I didn't take it out of your room. Marilla looked for the brooch again, but she couldn't find it. And she said, I will ask you again, did you take the brooch from my room and lost it? No, I did not, Marilla, said Anne quietly. Go to your room and stay there, said Marilla. Anne went to her room. Later, Marilla went to see her. Marilla, the party is tomorrow, Anne said. Please, can I go? No, said Marilla angrily. Tell me about the brooch first. But I told you about the brooch, Marilla, cried Anne. Next morning, Marilla took Anne's breakfast upstairs. Anne sat on her bed. Her face was white and her big grey eyes shone. I'll tell you about the brooch now, she said quietly. I took it and I put it on my dress. Then I went outside and walked down the road to the bridge. I wanted to look at the brooch again. So I took it off my dress. It shone in the sun and was very beautiful. But then it fell down from my hand. down, down to the bottom of the river. You are a very bad girl, Anne, Marilla said angrily. I am sorry, said Anne. Please, can I go to the party now? The party? Cried Marilla. Of course you can't go. But Marilla, said Anne, you wanted to know about the brooch, so I told you. Now, please, can I go to the party? No, said Marilla and went out. Anne fell on her bed and began to cry. Marilla went downstairs with very sad heart. Maybe Mrs. Lynde was right about Anne, she thought. After lunch, Marilla wanted to go for a walk. She took her coat from the closet. Then she saw something on her coat. It was her beautiful brooch. What's this? Thought Marilla in surprise. Oh, I remember now. I put the brooch on this coat. She went to Anne's room. Anne, why did you tell me that story this morning? She said. The brooch is here on my coat. I wanted to go to the party, said Anne sadly. You wanted me to tell you about the brooch, so I had to think of a story. Marilla began to laugh. I'm sorry, Anne, she said. I made a mistake. Now get ready for the party. Oh, Marilla, cried Anne. Isn't it too late? No, answered Marilla. It's only 2 o'clock. Wash your face and put on one of your new dresses. I will give you some food for the party. When Anne came home that evening, she was very happy. Oh, Marilla, the party was wonderful, she said. Marilla, said Anne one day, do any other little girls live near Green Gables? I would like to have a best friend. Yes, answered Marilla. Diana Barry is the same age as you. She lives at Orchard Slope across the river. I am going to visit her mother this afternoon. You can come with me. Mrs. Barry was a tall, thin woman. Diana was a very pretty little girl with black hair and dark eyes. She had a little sister, Minnie May. Minnie May was 3 years old. Diana, take Anne outside, said Mrs. Barry. Anne and Diana went outside and stood quietly by the flowers. Then they started to talk. They talked all afternoon. Did you like Diana, Anne? Asked Marilla later. Oh, yes, said Anne happily. Diana is wonderful. Anne and Diana met every day. Sometimes they played in woods. Sometimes they read books and told stories. Then summer ended and September came. Anne went to school in Avonlea. She was good at her lessons and she liked the other girls. But Anne didn't like the teacher, Mr. Phillips, very much. One day there was a new boy in school. He was tall with brown hair. The girls liked him. That is Gilbert Blythe, Diana said to Anne. His family went away for the summer. They came back on Saturday. Gilbert's desk was near Anne's desk. He often looked at her. He wanted her to look at him too. She was different from other girls in Avonlea, but Anne was not interested in Gilbert. Gilbert took Anne's hair in his hand. Carrots, he said loudly. Carrots, and jumped to her feet and looked at Gilbert angrily. I hate you, she cried. I hate you. She hit Gilbert on the head with her slate, and the slate broke. Everybody looked at her. Mr. Phillips ran to her. "Aunt Shirley, what are you doing?" he said. "Answer me." "Anne didn't do anything wrong," said Gilbert quickly. "I was rude about her hair." "Anne, go and stand in front of the class," said Mr. Phillips. Anne stood in front of the class afternoon. Everybody looked at her, but Anne didn't look at anybody. "I will never speak to Gilbert Blythe again," she thought. After school, Gilbert tried to talk to Anne, but she walked past him. "Don't be angry with Gilbert, Anne," said Diana. "He laughs at my hair because it's very black." "Gilbert Blythe was very unkind," said Anne. "The children often played outside after lunch. Sometimes they were late for afternoon school." The next day, Mr. Philip was in the classroom when Anne arrived with flowers in her hair. "Anne Shirley, you are late," Mr. Philip said. "Take those flowers out of your hair, then go and sit with Gilbert Blythe." "I can't sit next to Gilbert," Anne thought. "I hate him." She got up slowly from her desk and sat down next to Gilbert. But she didn't look at him. She put her head on her arms. A little later, Gilbert pushed some candy under Anne's arm. Anne took the candy and threw it onto the floor. At the end of the day, Anne took her slate and her books. "What are you doing, Anne?" asked Diana in surprise. "I'm taking my things home," said Anne. "I'm going to study there. I'm not coming back to school again." Later, Anne told Marilla about Mr. Phillips. "I will learn my lessons at home," she said. "I will work hard and I will be a good girl. I am not going back to Mr. Phillips." Marilla went to see Mrs. Lynde. "What shall I do?" she asked. "Leave Anne at home," said Mrs. Lynde. "She will get bored. Then she will want to go back to school." Anne learned her lessons at home. In the evening, she played with Diana. She loved Diana, but she hated Gilbert Blythe.